The theme of the panel is about innovation as mission and how industry can rediscover its mission, ensuring that innovation strengthens sovereignty instead of being captured by those who seek to undermine it. So I will start with you, Mr. Potjen. My first question is, what are the relevant lessons learned from the war in Ukraine, especially?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Basile and the whole team for the invitation. So far, so good, very interesting. Let me go straight to the answer. There are obviously many lessons, and this is part of the debate that NATO planners are having constantly about what is relevant, what is not relevant, and that should be applied mostly to NATO, Europe, and allies. And I would say there are three key lessons that we see emerging from the battlefield in Ukraine that should at least give us some pause for thoughts. First, we are operating, or Ukraine is operating, with a high battlefield transparency, meaning you are operating in the 10, 20 kilometers of the front line under almost complete ISR coverage. You have FPV drones, you have ISR operational and strategic drones, also space-based assets. You have data fusion, which allows both sides to see exactly live what is happening across the almost 1,000-kilometer front line in Ukraine, which means that you're operating in a highly contested environment, multi-domain environment. So our concept of dominance, mostly air dominance, for example, is defeated by what is happening on the front line in Ukraine. So this is one important lesson. And it also means that offensive and maneuver warfare is becoming increasingly complex and difficult to achieve in a highly transparent battlefield. Lesson number one. Lesson number two, and this is very familiar to all of you, and we are seeing that also with the Iran war, it's the high attrition warfare, where we're talking essentially about something like 25, 30,000 Russian casualties per month. We are talking about something like 70%, 70, of the strikes are performed by unmanned systems on the battle line. And for example, one figure, but there are many other figures, Ukraine is losing an average 10,000 drones a month. And yet it's fielding now close to 100,000 drones of all kind and all categories. It has had its drone production since 2023 to now multiplied by 10. So we are here in a context where mass matters, where quantity is a quality of its own, and therefore it's no longer about the quality of a specific platform or system, it's more about the mass you can mobilize, deploy, and regenerate, and how it operates in an integrated way. And then I will finish here. The third lesson is extremely compressed time cycle between innovation, deployment, repair, and upgrade. To give you again some figures, the unmanned ground systems that are increasingly being deployed also to compensate for the demographic deficit on the Ukrainian side, the unmanned ground systems have a lifespan of 1 to a week. And within this lifespan, they have to be repaired. And they have to be repaired as close to the front line as possible. We are seeing electronic warfare upgrade and changes almost on a weekly basis, which means that most of your FPV drones that don't operate with fiber optic or ISR drones need to be upgraded also with a very high cycle of upgrade. And another interesting data points about this very compressed time is most combat groups in Ukraine have their own innovation units. They don't necessarily innovate in the sense of creating new kind of drones, but they innovate in terms of iteration, in terms of upgrade, and in terms of adapting the systems they have to new electronic warfare and new, more contested environment. So I think these, for me, are the three really important lessons that hopefully our military leaders and planners will take into account when they look at their own planning.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Georgiakis, do you think that ELCAC has been successful during this short lifespan in strengthening innovation for the Hellenic Armed Forces?
Well, yes, LCAC is very successful so far. But I would like to give a little bit in a European perspective. And I would like to say that everybody in Europe were thinking as European, but we are acting national. That is a big issue that does not create the possibility of creating a common defense system and to secure the supply chain. So what we do in Greece, trying to see this issue also. And just to add one more point, still in Europe, 40% of our purchase and military equipment and services, they came from United States. And I will give you just a number, and you will understand the problem, is that, for example, in Europe, in Russia has produced 1,200 cruise missiles in a year. In Europe, we produce just 300. And this is numbers that it's extremely worry for Europe as a total. At the same time, we have to find a way to change a behavior that was in Europe all this year, that if you are going inside the universities or research centers speaking about defense or speaking about dual use, it was a forbidden word. And also the European Commission sending all the money for the research, basic research, applied research, but excluding the defense as a sector. This has created a big issue in Europe because, yes, we do have the prime, we do have, in some countries, prime, we do have the necessary industry, but it's not enough. So we have to rebuild the industrial capability of Europe. And in order to rebuild the industrial capability of Europe, we have to go with a very focused way to achieve that. For example, I will give two examples that happens in Greece. For example, laser as a beam. Okay, laser as a beam, if you go and try to find people that works on that, it will find very few, because up to now, Europe on laser, they were looking laser just as a medical device or just cleaning a building. They never look at that as a weapon. So we don't have developed the necessary engineers to support and to integrate a reactor that is the laser beam into a system of guns in a boat, in the terrains or whatever. Now, when we start a project on such an issue that there is not the necessary human capital, when I started in LCAC, I was speaking more on technology readiness level. That means how technology is ready. Now, I start to speak more on human readiness level. So, because these two goes together, you will not achieve industry, you will not achieve technology if you don't have the human people in order to upgrade them to support the transformation. So, in such a case, when we start a project, for example, on laser beam, we are moving in two directions. One direction is, let's go to cooperate with allies that they have a little bit more experience or much more experience than us on that issue. And at the same time, let's try to find inside Greece, in all the university research centers, the people that they study photonics, but they didn't study photonics for creating laser as a weapon. So we moved to that in parallel direction. From one side, to have a quick win, so to have something that it will be operational, but on the other side, to create the necessary human capital in order to achieve what we want to achieve. The same, for example, it happens on networks. I mean, at this point, there is a lot of discussion how the whole thing is going to be integrated. Consider that any asset, any device, it's kind of an Internet of Things, which is unmanned or manned. Now, each manned system controls a number of unmanned, and the number of unmanned, it could be aerial, it will be under the water, it will be surface. In order for this system to be interoperable, means that the asset could be interchangeable with other base station or with other device. You could not go in a way that you will buy, you will have 20 drones and you will have 20 different consoles and you are going to have 20 different systems in order to train the personnel. So all of this, it's a big issue that we try to resolve and to work together with the rest of the European countries. But also, and I'm finishing here, it's a big issue which has to do with Europe that, for example, the chain, the strong of a chain is the weakest part. And this weakest part means that if we in Europe we don't have motor, we will not have drone. So maybe motor, it's not the technology superiority, but it's something that if you don't have it, you will not work. Unfortunately, all the European financial tools are EDF or Horizon, all this kind of thing. What they do, they looking for technology superiority, but that's not enough. At the same time that you look for technology superiority, you should look at the same time for supply chain securizing the supply chain. So this is an open debate in Europe. A lot of things has happened in a positive way, but I think that having 30 years not working intensively on that and not working as a nation, but working as a separate nation, needs time in order to achieve the objective.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Brett, what are your remarks on innovation as a mission in industry of war?
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Αλεξία. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για το Βασίλη και για το Θεμιστόκλη. Θα σταματήσω με τα ελληνικά μου. Thank you very much again for organizing this summit. Forgive my French, but defense innovation has become a motto. It's good in a way because it attracts investments, a lot of analysis, a lot of energy, but it can be confusing. And I would like to stress that technological, industrial defense innovation is not enough, neither to win wars nor to avoid wars. Because innovation, defense innovation for the sake of defense innovation is not a strategic goal. This is only the dream of the director of the R&D department of a factory. I'd like to stress three major points. Technological industrial defense innovation is just a tiny element of a larger scope, of a larger framework of defense innovation. Because when you look at it, defense innovation encompasses, of course, new projects, new tools, new equipments, new technologies, etc. But it can encompass tactical innovations that have nothing to do with technology. They can encompass conceptual and strategic and political innovation. So when I was working, and I've been working for a long time in the defense industry sector, I was always amazed by the fact that my fellow engineers were thinking of defense innovation only through patents, products, technologies, but the investments, the technologies, the products are pointless if they cannot win on the battlefield or if they cannot contribute to the general warfare effort. So, 3 points. The defense innovation can be driven by the battlefield, by the operations. And Fabrice has just explained how deeply it has to be rooted in the fighting units. I don't have to comment on that because it can become the Ukrainian paradigm or model of defense innovation. It does not require long investment cycles. It does not require highly sophisticated technology. This is defense innovation on the battlefield, on the ground, and the result and the criterion of assessment of that innovation can happen overnight. This is defeat or victory. And it means in terms of investments of technologies, many, many things. The first one being it has to get a short-term result. You don't have the time to make planification on such kind of innovation. Second kind of defense industrial innovation, this is not wartime defense innovation, this is tension or deterrence defense innovation. You are not at war, neither you are at peace. It can be the situation of many European countries. I love Greece, you know that, I've been spending years here, but this is exactly the situation I felt here. Not war times, neither peace times. In that case, you have more time, and you have to avoid a very large mistake, which is innovation in the short run. You have to be ready not for the short run, and I know that ELCAC is doing that, preparing for the next stages, not in the short run, but in the medium run. And the way you present defense innovation to investors, the way you present it to the ministers, to the staffs, to the military staff, is completely different from the battlefield defense innovation. It has to be thought in the larger framework of the medium-run operation system of the armed forces. You have more time, but it means that mistakes can cost a lot. If the result cannot be assessed on the battlefield overnight, it means that mistakes can happen in the planification. And this is, I think, the key challenge for the Western European countries that are not at war, but have to prepare for that. And most probably, in that respect, technological, industrial innovation should be aimed at deterrence. You have to catch up with the emerging technologies on the battlefield, but you have to prepare for the battle afterwards, not for the next one. And third, and I think this is very important, and I take it from a civilian point of view, innovation has become a motto in the defense industry, but it can be also an economic goal. And it's been reminded by Mr. Hardalias, and it's been reminded by Mr. Hardalias when he was a deputy defense minister too. Innovation, defense innovation, industrial defense innovation has to produce civilian outcomes. Of course, employment. And ELCAC is developing many, many programs aimed at enhancing the skills of the manpower, and you insisting on that. But one of the, and forgive my French point of view on that, is the dual use of defense innovation. When you are in a period of tensions, but you are not fighting a war, you have to think of the general welfare of the society. The resilience is based on the capacity of society to use defense innovation for civilian purpose. Okay, we all have in mind the way technologies can be used for the civilian defense, can be used for not by the armed forces but by the police services. But on a larger stage, we have to bear in mind that the defense industrial groups have a larger responsibility for the civilian technologies and for the civilian sectors in order, for example, for Greece or for France or for many, many other countries, defense investments cannot be targeted only at fighting wars. So thank you very much for your question. I think that I made my point. Defense innovation is not only and should not be reduced to a question of winning on the battlefield in the very short run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'll come back to you, Mr. Potier. You mentioned about the relevant lessons. How can Europe apply to the defense industry those lessons?
Yes, and I think Cyril's intervention really helps to frame how we need to look at defense innovation applied to NATO, Europe, and allies. And I will really concur with his point, which is what the Ukrainians are doing, essentially this drone or unmanned systems warfare, is helping them to blunt the Russian pressure, but is not helping them to win. It's not producing, drone warfare is not yet proven to produce a decisive outcome. It can neutralize, but it cannot allow, because it doesn't provide enough integrated push to be able to plan an offensive and achieve an outcome. So I will really concur with that. However, I think let me just frame it along those points. There are also differences between Ukraine and Europe, and this is important to state those. First, we don't have a demographic deficit like Ukraine has vis-à-vis Russia. I mean, Ukraine was 37 million people before the full-scale invasion versus Russia in the 120 million. Ukraine also has an artillery and precision fire deficit vis-à-vis Russia. Still nowadays, even though Ukrainian artillery production has increased considerably, 3-1 disadvantage vis-à-vis Russia. And then we also have something the Ukrainians did not have on the onset of the war and don't have yet, is air and maritime systems that allow to be able to operate and in a way be able to secure those critical space. They have shown in the Black Sea their capacity to deny the Russian Black Sea fleet an area of operation, but they have not been able to actually operate and recreate a kind of freedom of operation in the Black Sea. So I think these are important differences. However, we also need to be honest about our own deficits. First, we may have 1 million plus European soldiers on paper vis-à-vis Russia's 1 million plus, but effectively we are, in terms of force readiness across NATO Europe, we're able to deploy 100,000 maximum forces. That is versus Russia that has currently 600,000 plus Russian forces deployed in Ukraine. We also know from open sources that Europe may have many combat aircraft that can proudly match Russian combat aircraft numbers and capabilities, but we also know we have between 7 to 10 days of missile and precision munition inventory. So we will be able to hold a high-intensity air combat warfare for no more than a week. And finally, what you said earlier, we also operate with highly fragmented defense industrial landscape, many systems, many different players, creating often very advanced and exquisite products, including Naval Group, but also struggling to create the scale that is now needed to be able to respond to the current threat. So what does it mean? I would say, and this is will be my last points, I think it's 3 key points. First, I think NATO, Europe, and defense industrial, and I put both the primes and the scale-up starters, have to think about diversification and democratization downward. Meaning, when it comes to cruise missiles, you're right, and I think the Americans produce 100 Tomahawks a year. A Tomahawk costs roughly between 3-5 million, depending on which type and which client, dollars. And the Shahed or Geran drone costs something like between $50,000 a piece. So we have a kind of cost asymmetry that we need to solve. And we can only solve that if we look at actually simpler, cheaper systems where, for example, we should look at low-cost deep strike capabilities rather than relying on including European solutions only or American solutions only. Second, I think we need to, and this is where I concur with Cyril, it's not just about the technology, it's about how integrated it is. And I can see across NATO Europe a rush to acquire gadgets, to acquire drones, because we need to show we are on top of this new warfare. But it's not about the drones, and also the drones that you acquire now are going to be they're going to be outdated for sure in few months and few years. So it's about how integrated your forces can operate both with the old and the new, and how effect the sum of these can create. And then finally, I think we need to rethink also the defense industrial supply chain project. We need to come up with systems that are less complex to produce, but also less complex to repair, because the war of attrition that Russia is putting to us, and potentially China, is actually a war where you have to be able to upgrade, but also being able to recover and rescale as quickly as possible. We produce some cruise missiles in Europe that are great, but that are very complex to replace. We produce some frigates that are very impressive, and congratulations to Naval Group for the contract with the Swedes, but the problem is they're also vulnerable, and if they're hit, it's very hard to replace. So we need to think about unmanned systems that can complement this.
Thank you. I will ask you later to comment on what Fabrice said, but first let me go to Mr. Drazakis.
I could not agree more.
Okay.
So just to finish.
Of course.
And I also agree with Cyril. We have a slightly different goal than the Ukrainians. We have to achieve conventional deterrence.
Of course.
The Ukrainians have to defend. And achieving conventional deterrence, drones are don't have a huge deterrence effect. They have a defensive effect. So we also need the things that can signal to Russia that we can hold our ground, and we will be able to interdict them any move to take any square kilometer of the NATO soil. So it means we have to do two things at the same time, the mass, but also the edge.
Okay, I'm going first to Mr. Drazakis. Mr. Drazakis, what is that you need and don't have yet from the Minister of National Defense now, not in 6 months or a year, to accelerate the defense projects that are already under consideration?
Yeah, okay, we're a new organization, we're just 2 years, but in initial capability, we start 1.5 years, and full capability, it's less than 6 months now. So what I will envision to have is to have more freedom to operate as a private entity, but serving the public interest, of course. That's something that needs more work to be done. We achieve significant steps so far. I think that this freedom of moving ahead, it will help a lot the organization, and I will give an example. I will go back to United States when it was the Second World War, and at that point it was a decision that the United States, they are going to join the Second World War. What happened? President Roosevelt has called the Dean of MIT and created the Chief Technology Office inside the White House and gave them a full and clear mandate, create everything that is necessary in order to win the war. and that happens. A lot of things that we still use every day today, you know more than me, is internet. It was a DARPA project, a GPS, it was a DARPA project. All the things that we are using today, it comes its root from military project. Now, I think the reason for that is that whatever we want it or not, the defense market, it's a very small market if you compare it with a civilian market. So when we speak in dual use, in order a company, startups, or even a prime, to be long-term profitable and able to survive, it has to serve both audience. I mean, the civilian and the. Now, in Europe again, and I'm speaking as a European, in Europe again, we have a lot of things that we have to improve, and if we don't accept that we're doing something wrong, we will never correct. And I will give an example. In Europe, in startup community, we are taking the risk, we're creating venture capital, we are going to seed one or to seed two, that means the first raising of capitals. But if you go to a serious capital raising in order to create a scale-up, we don't have a common financial market. And what happens, the companies, in order to be scale-up, they have to go to United States. And this is a big issue for Europe, because we're taking all the risk at the first stage of financing, and we don't have the capability to finance in a scale. Why that happens? Because, for example, in the United States, there is a percentage, if I remember well, it's a 3%. So they have a 3% on all the institutional money that they have to spend 3% on high technology and risk investment. And that creates a huge financial market in order to support the new start, in order to support the new startups. Now, let's take another example, which is very close to us. The whole Europe has less unicorn than Israel as a country. That means, and don't tell me that, you know, they have the support of United States and all this kind of thing, which is true, but the money goes whatever they could create results. If they could not create result in Israel, they could not go to invest in Israel. So that's something that in Europe we have to change. So what it will be my dream is to work much more as looking the two sectors, which is the civilian and defense, and trying to create companies which is going to be sustainable long-term in order to support and the national interest of defense, of security, but at the same time to be major contributor to the financial growth of our economy.
Thank you, Mr. Georgakis. Now, Mr. Brett, I don't know if you would like to comment on what Fabrice said before and regarding the role of Naval in Europe and in the area.
No, I won't comment because this is neither my place nor the need. I think that Fabrice has made it very, very clear. What I would like to stress is that innovation driven only by prestige or geeks who love technologies is not a good point. We need geeks, we need specialists, we need people passionate about innovation, technological innovation, but this is not enough. And it cannot meet the challenges that Europe is facing, neither at sea, nor on the ground, neither in the cyberspace, nor in the air. We need And I would rather be critical on many, many ways the private companies are talking with the military comrades. It cannot be, innovation cannot be driven neither by prestige nor by market shares. Because at the end of the day, wars are fought, won or lost by soldiers on the battlefield and by nations as a population. So innovation has to, and sorry for that to keep on saying what you said, Pat Dalis, it's a very large investment, innovation, defense innovation. It's a sacrifice. When you invest in defense, you have to bear in mind that you don't invest in schools, hospitals, in police forces, so it has to give up. It has to give the society the benefits that it needs. Protection, of course. Resilience, it goes without saying now. But it has to produce benefits for the global society. And in that respect, I think that, for example, the conceptual innovation of Agenda 2030 by Minister Dendias is not a technological one, but it's a conceptual innovation that encompasses LCAC, many, many things I do admire a lot, but it encompasses innovation, for example, in the training of the troops. And the training of the troops has nothing to do with technological innovation, but it has many, many things to do with political innovation. Mobilization of the population is a larger part of the innovation. So to put the emphasis once more on prestige innovation, on gadgets that Fabrice has pinpointed, I think we are in the wrong place, because it doesn't match the needs of the European nations yet. And the US elephant in the room shows us that industrial defense innovation has to be tackled in a systematic way. What is at play, what is at stake in the US for defense innovation is the way that defense innovation is embedded in all the industrial fabric of the nation. This is not the case yet in Europe. It will be the case. I have the hope that it will be the case, but we have to, in that respect, we have to take lessons from the US cousins.
Thank you. Now, Fabrice, I would like to ask you your analysis and your experience on international stage, because we had the NATO summit in Ankara in July, which is a very important summit given the circumstances and the critical developments in the Middle East. Trump is about to come. We hasn't confirmed yet, but he's of course invited there. So what, to your experience, are the scenarios that will happen during this very important NATO summit?
So I think the question is whether Ankara is going to be a divorce summit, a chambre à part summit, or a new vows summit. And I think the jury is still out to an extent that I think the US administration has to solve the problem it has boxed itself in when it comes to Iran. Which, you know, the impact, especially with the Strait of Hormuz on European economies, including Greece, which is also one of the largest importers of oil coming from the Gulf, not gas but oil. So I think the US has to solve this to come to Ankara, I think, with the air at least clear to an extent. Because clearly the Europeans are willing to put on the table some sort of maritime mission deployment, to be seen if it will fall under NATO, under EU, under a coalition. I think that's a more technical consideration, technical and legal. But so I think that's one thing. Second, yes, Trump is not confirmed yet, but I will be surprised that he will not come because I think President Erdogan will take a great offense, and Trump likes strongman politics. And if he comes, it's not to sit with the allies, it's to sit with President Erdogan. And so there will be a lot of strongman politics and handshake. Then when the doors close and the conversation starts, I think there will be probably two conversations to be had. One, how do you think defense, the industrialization of defense innovation first, what does it mean? Second, what does it mean from a transatlantic point of view, given that now we are increasingly talking about diversification, strategic autonomy, but that we're also still to a large extent dependent on US technology, US firms, and that they're actually great firms, and they're also newcomers coming from the US. It's not just US primes. They're also US scale-up and startups who are trying to solve the same problems that we're trying to solve in Europe and that our own scale-up are trying to solve. So I think it's going to be, is there a new transatlantic entente when it comes to defense innovation? Because clearly the US, yes, has innovation much more embedded in the way the Pentagon operates, has obviously a fiscal muscle that we are not matching yet, even though it's the venture capital sector in Europe is growing, but not at the scale of the US. But the US has the same problem as us. Look at Iran. There's a problem of depletion of very expensive interceptors and missiles, which are no longer fit for purpose when it comes to relatively cheap strike drones, attack drones. So I think the US has to solve the same problem, but obviously with its scale that allows for more room for maneuver and more risk-taking. And then finally, the other conversation that I think most probably the European leaders will be having in the bilateral meetings, not in the North Atlantic Council conversation, will be where is there a European core that can be built and strengthened inside NATO to make NATO still a valid proposition for Europe. Because the current state of affairs is Donald Trump has injected a significant doubt when it comes to US guarantees to Europe. US military is still committed. Cooperation at both the diplomatic and military level is as it was before. But the problem is NATO is fundamentally a political project. Deterrence is not about how many tanks you have and how many forces you have, even though that matters. It's about the political commitment to support the other. And obviously Donald Trump, with Greenland especially, and a few other comments, has introduced a significant doubt into the US commitment, which means Europeans have to figure out, is NATO Europeanizing NATO? Is it possible? What does it mean? Or do we have to start thinking about an alternative framework and scenario? And I think this is the conversation at NATO summit. From my experience, I've done a few of them. You always have the official conversations, the deliverables, the communiqué, but you always have the more meaningful conversations happening in the background. And I think this is the one that will probably take place.
Thank you. I would like to thank you all for this very interesting conversation on innovation. Mr. Brett, Mr. Georgakis, and Mr. Potier, thank you so much. You may step down. Thank you.